I don't tell people this story much, but my therapist thought it might help me to talk about it. So here we are. I guess it doesn't hurt to get it out there. Besides, I've noticed that people often have a hard time believing stories like mine, and they tend to brush them off as just wild tales. But hey, maybe you'll listen, or not. Honestly, at this point, I'm beyond caring. This whole thing started one summer when 3 of my friends, Alex, Paul, and Chris, and I were hanging out in the woods behind Paul's house. We were all sneaking a cigarette or two since we were about 15 years old, with Alex being the youngest at 14. Chris was the wild one in the group, and he had this cool vibe that somehow influenced the rest of us to try smoking. His dad smoked too, which made Chris feel even cooler. So we started spending more time at Paul's place, venturing deeper into the woods, searching for the perfect spot to smoke and act all tough. That day, we wandered down a narrow path for quite some time, until we spotted this little shack in the distance. It stood out against the orange glow of the sunset. As we approached it, we could see that it was falling apart. The roof sagged and the window next to the door was missing bits of glass. It looked abandoned, which made it all the more intriguing. "Hey, Paul, you ever come back here before?" Chris asked, ducking under a low branch to squint at the shack. "Nope," Paul replied, shoving his cigarette between his lips as he leaned against a tree. "Nobody usually comes out to these woods. None of my neighbors want to bother with clearing the paths." "Probably just some old storage shed," I said, eyeing the rickety steps leading up to the front door. The wood looked rotten and ready to crumble. Suddenly, Alex shouted, "Whoa, look at this!" He pointed at a large dark stain on the porch. "I think that's blood." We all froze and stared at the dark spot. It really did look like blood. I glanced at Paul and Alex, noting how their faces scrunched up with discomfort. "Let's check it out," Chris exclaimed, tossing his cigarette aside and stepping forward towards the porch. "I don't know, man," Paul said, his face falling. "That looks really fresh. I don't want to trespass into something like a murder scene." "Come on! It's probably just animal blood," Chris insisted, looking at us like we were being overly cautious. "What's the matter? You scared?" "Chris, it's getting dark," I chimed in, trying to sound braver than I felt. I didn't want to seem like a wimp, but that place gave me the creeps. I've got to get home before my parents start freaking out. Chris kept egging us on, making fun of our fears all the way home. But honestly, once we were apart, I forgot about the shack for the time being and moved on with my life. The next week, though, things shifted. Chris started acting kind of strange. At first, we didn't really notice it, but the more we hung out, the weirder he got. He'd just sit on the grass at school for hours, smoking and staring at people like he was studying them. It wasn't that awkward teenage staring. It was unsettling and felt almost predatory. One time, we were behind the school, trying to keep up with Chris's smoking so he wouldn't tease us about being soft. A random frog hopped by, and without any hesitation, Chris picked it up. Then, before we could say anything, he extinguished his cigarette on the frog's back. It squirmed, but it didn't seem seriously hurt, yet the casual cruelty made Alex visibly uncomfortable. "Chris, what the hell?" Alex said, looking horrified. He was usually the sweetest one among us. "You've got to stop that." Chris just smirked, looking at the frog like it was some toy. "What's the big deal? This bother you guys?" Then, in a heartbeat, he flung the poor thing into a wall like it was nothing. It hit the brick with a sickening sound, and we were all grossed out, turning away. "Seriously, you gonna start taking cats next?" Paul said, sounding mad. Chris just laughed it off like it was no biggie. Not long after that, we spent a night at Chris's place because his parents were away. He had snuck some booze from the house, and we got a bit tipsy. We were joking around about girls when Chris suddenly went quiet. Out of nowhere, he jumped up and went to the window, staring outside before turning to us with a glint in his eyes. "Hey, do you want to see something I snagged from that shack?" he asked, and immediately the atmosphere shifted. "I didn't see you go in there," Paul replied, eyeing him cautiously. "Not with you guys. I went back and you wouldn't believe what I found. There's so much in that house. There's knowledge, man," Chris said, his excitement unnerving us. "What are you saying, Chris? What the heck are you talking about?" I asked, feeling more confused than anything else. He looked so serious. "Just follow me. One at a time, though. Alex, you go first." Without waiting, he headed upstairs, leaving us to exchange worried looks. "He's your friend. You can go with him," Paul suggested, his voice filled with concern. "Nah, I'm good," Alex said, brushing it off. "It's probably nothing anyway." He walked out, somewhat unsteady from the drink. There was silence for a moment, and then we heard a high-pitched scream come from upstairs. It sent chills down my spine. We raced out to follow the sound, catching a glimpse of Alex bolting down the street, looking pale and terrified. "Alex!" I shouted, but he just kept running, stopping only to throw up in the gutter. "What did you do to him?" I turned angrily to Chris, who was now standing in the doorway looking amused. "He was drunk. He just needed time to process it. If he was sober, it wouldn't have scarred him like that." "What did you show him?" I pressed. Chris hesitated and then just said, "See for yourself." He walked back up the stairs. I turned to Paul, who was equally confused and worried. "I'm checking on Alex. Dude, just go home. This whole thing feels off. Just don't feel like you have to see whatever it was. Trust me, it isn't worth it." I nodded, but something in me wanted to know. I walked into the kitchen and found a knife in the drawer. I stuck it in my pocket. I was interested, but who knew what Chris was up to? Nervously, I climbed the stairs and pushed open Chris's bedroom door. It was dark and he stood there, his figure barely visible. "Want to see it?" he asked, holding a box. I took a step closer, my heart racing, and nodded. He cracked the lid just a touch and I leaned in to look. In a split second, I saw something I'll never forget. I backed away quickly. "What the hell, Chris?" "Did you see it?" he asked, urgency in his voice. "Not all of it. But those were eyes, weren't they? I swore I had seen human-like eyes staring back at me. What the hell are those?" "Forget about it. Just get out." He seemed agitated, pushing me toward the door. "What's going on, man?" I messed up. "Let me check on Alex." He rapidly headed downstairs before I could respond. I hesitated, not sure what to do. I found myself lingering at the door, trying to process everything. With a heavy heart, I walked home, my mind racing. I found my dad's computer and started searching for news about that shack, or anything strange that might have happened. I thought about contacting my parents, but the fear of them smelling booze on me kept me from acting on it. Then, movement by the window caught my attention. I turned nervously to see a lone figure outside, just standing there, glancing around. My stomach twisted in knots. I felt completely on edge as I switched off the lights and tiptoed to my room, grabbing a baseball bat, unsure of what to expect. As I crept back to the window, I realized it was Chris coming up to my porch. I thought maybe he was okay. Maybe I could finally unlock the door. But then, as he stepped into the light, my heart dropped. He was covered in blood. At first, I thought maybe he had gotten hurt, but then I remembered how he'd been moving when he came closer to my house, like he was scoping out the area. My breath caught in my throat. Chris raised a hand and I noticed something shiny. My heart raced. Was that a knife? But as he got closer, I realized it was just a spoon. He knocked on the door with it, and I could see clear streaks of red on his shirt. Panic surged through me. I hustled down the stairs as quietly as I could, trying to get the door locked before he could get inside. I fumbled with the latch, but just as I was about to secure it, he knocked again and I nearly jumped. Terrified, I locked the door and backed away into the shadows. Chris's head turned this way and that as he checked the surroundings, hunting for a way in. Our eyes met, and in that moment, everything went cold. I couldn't take it anymore. I dashed to the backsliding door and locked it just as he thudded against the glass. He looked wild, with blood splattered everywhere. I didn't want to face whatever was happening. Hearing him punch the door made me jump out of my skin. Moments later, I heard footsteps receding, and I imagined him prowling around the place. I did my best not to breathe too loudly as I sat huddled against the door, praying my parents hadn't left any windows open. Suddenly, I was jolted upright by the sound of screeching tires. Lights illuminated the kitchen wall, and I peeked outside just in time to see a car pull into our driveway. My heart leaped. My parents had come home. But wait, a man busted out of the car, barreling toward the porch. He tackled Chris, and in the chaos, I noticed a gun in his hand. My heart sank. It was Alex's dad. He was shouting at Chris while brandishing the gun, pushing it against Chris's face with all his might. I'll never erase those words from my memory. My son's eyes. What did you do with my son's eyes?